Whether God exists or not, we have certainly made him a variety of houses and shaped the world and ourselves in the light and shade of divinity. Man has written endlessly, beautifully, inscrutably, and, he claims, truly in God's honor. Whether or not God created the world, mankind has lived and died in love and fear of him. But where does God actually live? Is it simply in the faithful hearts of his believers? And where does one go to begin to trace the relationship between God and man? Well, first things first, God's last known address, Jerusalem. There's not much risk of Jew or Christian or Muslim ever forgetting Jerusalem. In fractious piety, their competing faiths jostle for priority on the skyline. Domes and spires, crosses and crescents, only the Jews sport no obvious architectural symbols. If you could phone God from here, so the Jewish joke runs, it would only be a local call. Or you could always write to him.
We have here a letter, Jesus somewhere in Jerusalem. This one is written only to God.
This has no address, it came automatically
Yes,
to Jerusalem.
Usually people write only to God and they suppose that it will be delivered.
What sort of things do they ask for?
A few months ago, somebody wrote to God and he asked him to help to pay for electricity. So all of my workers gave a little bit of money to help him. After a while, he wrote again to God to help him to get married his daughter. So it was too much for us.
What will happen to these letters? Will you pass them on?
Most of the letter I deliver to the Wailing Wall. God's
mailbox, decidedly crammed, but not very often cleared. Perhaps God need not stoop to collection. He can scan his post at one all-seeing glance. Some write to God, others turn up at his house, or what's left of it, the Wailing Wall. Piety surges through them as if they were iron filings, invisibly impelled by a magnet. Where Jehovah's headquarters once stood, Muhammad took flight to heaven, and his followers erected the Dome of the Rock, a mosque where Jews do not dare or care to trespass. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, just outside the city walls. Every tree here stands for one righteous Gentile who helped Jews when they were being hunted and murdered in Hitler's crusade, often to the applause of their God-fearing Christian neighbors. Whom God abandoned, these defended.
Well, you have to hope this isn't all the righteous Gentiles there were. This is the best that Christendom could do, is it? Not much of a showing. Certainly not a forest, is it?
Yet Christianity continues, as if Christ's self-sacrifice remained the literally crucial event of human history.
The philosopher Theodor Adorno said, "After Auschwitz, no poetry." It's interesting that he didn't say after Auschwitz, no more God, even though he was in fact a Marxist. And when one looks at this piece of work, impressive and serious and honorable though it is, one wonders whether there can be any art after Auschwitz either. Because this, in a way, is a memorial which might be of a catastrophe, but cannot really ever deal with the catastrophe of the dimensions of Auschwitz. It's if I may say so, almost a parody of what a memorial would be, just as our idea of God after Auschwitz is perhaps a parody of what he was before.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, in its way, a parody of Christian unity. The tenancy of the Church is shared between Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox, Copts and Armenians, Franciscans and Ethiopians, none of whom is exactly the loving neighbor of the next. Man and his God are nothing if not territorial, and heaven help the trespasser. The spot where Jesus' crucifix was supposedly erected, Calvary itself, where the Greeks hold sway. Their inscription insists that the Saviour's body was drained of blood before he could ascend into heaven, as if a kosher butcher had officiated at his execution. Above the queue waiting to kiss Jesus' tomb, a dome, reminiscent of Hadrian's Pantheon, where pagan gods and divine emperors were honored. On the roof are the Ethiopians. Ejected from the main body of the church after a territorial squabble, they squat in attics, left behind by the Crusaders. Closer to heaven, they at least have more room up here to store their pious props. There's another alternative Calvary, complete with its own sepulchre and tended by typically green-fingered Anglicans.
The Tomb Association was formed in 1893.
I was shown the supposed tomb of the condemned criminal Jesus by a very genial excavation officer. He admitted with British candour that it might very well not be the sacred spot at all. Still, at least the English have the place to themselves.
If during the service, after we've been round with the communion, anyone would like a laying on of hands for yourself or somebody else, then please would you ask for it when we get to that point. Don't be afraid to.
Joining an impromptu communion, I was reminded of days in school chapel when I furtively refrained from bowing my head at the mention of Jesus Christ, hoping, like many Jews before Israel lent muscle to our image, not to be caught in the act of being different. When the sun sets, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has to be locked up. The question is, what group among the competing and mutually suspicious varieties of Christianity is going to be in charge of the key? Ironically enough, the key has been in the reliable hands of a Muslim family for many generations. The Arabs had seized it from the Crusaders, and when the Christians finally regained control, they left the key in the custody of the heathen, rather than wrestle with each other for its exclusive control, as they surely would have. Every Friday at 3 p.m. sharp, Franciscan monks lead a parade of reverent tourists along the Via Dolorosa, in the Arab quarter of the Old City. In Jerusalem, one God's worshippers flow in and around another's, and another's. The Catholics will tell you that Jesus took this sad road to his crucifixion, but archaeologists are not so sure. Still, what is truth if faith says otherwise? For me, the Holocaust is a greater calamity for man and God than the crucifixion. But that's a partial view, of course. The Jews had their crown of thorns at Auschwitz and Treblinka. The thorns went deeper, I sometimes think, than they did with Jesus, who does, after all, sit on the right hand of God. The ashes of European Jewry know no such resurrection. What is religion without its souvenir market? What is anything without a market, after all? The prophetic and the profitable often ride in tandem. One man's God is another man's idol. One man's faith is another man's madness. Luckily, most of us don't have to make the distinction. But if you're a psychiatrist in Jerusalem treating dozens of wannabe messiahs every year, that's exactly what your clinical duty is.
How do you distinguish between sane and insane religious beliefs?
Our problem in a lot of cases is the not clear-cut boundaries between a person with a deep conviction, perhaps bizarre, and real mental ill disease. If a person said today that he can walk on the water, or they can make from one piece of bread a complete dinner or something like this, in a very strictly psychiatric point of view, you say these people are not normal.
Are there messiahs in Jerusalem at the moment, people who say they are the messiah?
All the time we have messiahs. Oh. And we have here now, in Shaul Hospital, two messiahs from Israel. One is a very clear mentally ill person. The second we don't know because it's only from yesterday.
Old Jerusalem seems immune to time. This is the gate from which a Jew called Saul set out for Damascus. On the road, a blinding light inspired him to become St. Paul, who turned the unique God of the Jews into just 1/3 of the Christian Trinity. Arabs, meanwhile, did not yet have the militant faith which Muhammad taught them 600 years later. Almost 2,000 years after St. Paul, Arab East Jerusalem still feels like an occupied city. Whether Jehovah is looking down at all this with vindicated satisfaction, or Allah in slow fury, who is to say?
Is Allah interested in politics? Does he have political views? You're not offended.
If Allah is interested in politics, no, I don't believe Allah is interested in politics.
Well, this leads to another question.
But I have to explain what I mean, because that will put me in trouble with some people who may not understand what I mean. If we use the Holy Quran, if we read the Holy Quran, or if we read the Hadith of Prophet Muhammad, Allah is interested in justice. Allah is interested in fairness. Allah is interested in having people come to know Him. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam comes from the one source, from heavens, from the one who sits on the throne above the 7 heavens, from the Almighty Allah. Should you want to call Him God, it's fine, but He is the one, the same one. If you believe in the Day of Judgment, if you believe in the heavens of God, if you believe in God Himself, then whether you are a Jew or a Christian, you are a Muslim, because you are a submitter.
Is this submission to a God who does things in the world, or allows things to happen in the world, or what?
Both.
Why does He allow hatreds to exist in the world?
I don't believe that Allah allows hatred. I believe that man is created in such a manner that he always has an alternative. You can hate and you can love. You can do good deeds and you can do bad deeds. You can believe and you can disbelieve.
Is the the problem which divides this city spiritually? A problem of a clash of theologies, of gods, or a clash of politics masquerading as a clash of gods?
I think the last one. I think it's a clash of politics. If I'm praying in my beautiful and dear mosque, and 100 or 200 meters to the west of where I'm praying, a Jew is praying to the same God, is he going to disturb me? The answer is no. Now I say to my Jewish neighbor, give me a break for God's sake. I have people. I have traditions. I have history.
You can't blame Muslims for feeling aggrieved. The Dome of the Rock is, after all, a sacred place. But it was built on the rubble of Solomon's temple, and it was designed as palpable, if beautiful, evidence of Arab conquest of what had been a Jewish and Christian city. What's curious is how different religions often have similar validating miracles and mythologies and holy places. The dome covers the rock from which the Prophet Muhammad, like Elijah and Jesus before him, ascended into heaven. Zionist myth insisted that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. But that was to reckon without the Arabs. In the Middle East, a site need not be old to be symbolic or a bone of savage contention. Even building a so-called suburb of Jerusalem on a godforsaken hillside like Har Homa has become a symbol of Israeli self-assertion, a deep wound in the flank of what had long been Arab territory, even though no one actually lived there. Godforsaken, not as Jews and Arabs see it. From the hilltop, you can see Bethlehem, once a peaceful little town. This is no new piece of religious architecture. It's armor plating to protect the tomb of Rachel, the wife of the patriarch Isaac. A Jewish shrine in an Arab town.
Thank you.
The Jews are the people of the book, and by God, there ain't much here but the book. Only Jews could build a tomb with its own library. This shrine has supposedly been here for thousands of years, but it looks oddly unfinished and certainly a bit charmless. Are these my sisters? Are these my brothers? They sound to me as if they're bidding in some kind of spiritual auction, vying for God's attention. Spinoza wrote, "It's ignoble to suppose that God intervenes in the affairs of mankind." Ignoble, or at the very least, risky. My Israeli guide took me deeper into the West Bank, to the ancient Arab city of Hebron, and another shrine, in the heart of an ultra-Zionist settlement.
So what does it say here?
So here is buried the saint, Dr. Baruch Goldstein, and so on. And then it says, gave his soul for the people of Israel, his Torah, and his land.
And do these people think that God approved of what he did?
Well, probably, if they call him a saint.
Yes.
In 1994, Dr. Baruch Goldstein machine-gunned Muslims at prayer in the mosque. 29 of them died. Yet Dr. Goldstein had once treated Jews and Arabs alike. Fanaticism banished neutrality. A healer made incurable the plague of mutual hatred in Hebron. The dusty square at the crossroads of Jewish-Arab enmity, where pilgrims come, or came, to see the tomb of the patriarch Abraham, common ancestor of Jew and Arab alike. The tomb may belong to both, but is a place of shared heritage and separate entrances, of bad neighbors and brotherly hate. Jews and Arabs must ascend to Abraham's tomb by different staircases and on different days. This was the only occasion I've ever been asked by a soldier, "Are you Jewish?" I said yes with a curious apprehension that there might be an ugly consequence. But the soldier was Jewish too, and there wasn't. Since the camera crew were Gentiles, I had to go on alone. Take it on trust. The crew had missed nothing worth losing their foreskins for. The mosque I couldn't go to, because I'm a Jew. Thanks to Dr. Goldstein, a thronging tourist attraction is now reduced to a deserted village, where few now choose to go, and where tension has evicted prosperity. To which God, and for what, does anyone give thanks for this? Perhaps we should ask the zealots who gather at sunset to dance and pray back at Goldstein's grave, the shrine of a mass murderer. One can only suppose that they live by a different clock and swear by a different God. It was only in about 1975 that God insisted that religious Zionist settlers implant themselves deep in Arab territory. This is Shiloh, said in the Bible to be where the Ark of the Covenant between Jehovah and the Israelites once rested. The Crusaders built their castles. The Jews have built a domed yeshiva, a place for settlers to be single and very narrow-minded defenders of territory to which they have no clear title.
If one is going to use the Bible as the source of one's leases of land, this is going to create, to say that these certain problems because different people have different holy books. Can there be another God for other people?
The one God that I believe in is the one God because there are many paths to him. The one God doesn't mean that there is only one belief. The one God means that there are many, many paths and that all paths lead to him.
Is Allah another God?
Allah, as far as I'm concerned, is a vision of the same God that I believe in.
A few days ago we visited Hebron, and we then went up to the settlement where there is, for want of a better term, a shrine to Dr. Goldstein, who shot 29 Arabs when they were praying. Now, could not a Palestinian argue that, as it were, their God has ample reason to doubt the propriety of a Jewish state? How does that one work?
First of all, a Palestinian could argue that, and if he did, I would completely understand it. But as far as I can tell, there's a difference between a number of actions that were taken by individual Jews and by an infrastructure, an organizational infrastructure, whose goal is terrorism, that is supported by a majority of the villagers in the villages that surround Shiloh.
But perhaps the surrounding people favor the action of the Arabs because they are Arabs. They regard the settlers as invasive interlopers with a Zionist infrastructure and backed by a very partisan God.
How does one reconcile a God who can acquiesce by his silence in the Holocaust and who then at some later stage, in particular the 67 war, pops up to redeem his promise to the people of Israel? Is the God that you envision the kind of God who might have had second thoughts?
God always has second thoughts. The experience that the Jews have had all the way through history, and what the Bible seems to continually come back to, is that there is an interrelationship between God speaking to the world and the world speaking back to God. And that, as the prophets described it, is in a sense a relationship similar to that of a husband and wife, who don't always live in marital bliss, but they always live with an image of marital bliss that is an underpinning to their daily squabbles.
Do you have second thoughts about certain things? Never mind, let's leave God to have his.
The first thing that you learn when you learn the Talmud as a religious text is that disagreement is the culture of this religion. The balance between certainty and doubt is nothing to run away from. It's nothing to strangle certainty because one has doubts, and it's nothing to strangle the creativity of the doubt because one lives with certain certainties.
The Crusader kingdoms of the Middle East are, like modern France and Britain, no longer of much consequence here. Only armies of tourists now disembark in the Holy Land to take it not by storm, but by char-a-banc. This is not just one more river. It's the river of Jordan, where John the Baptist made his name. Let's hear it, folks, for the reborn.
Bruce, Aaron, Robert, we baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
The River Jordan is sacred to Christians. The Sea of Galilee, too. For secular Israelis, it's more a riviera. The simplest way of accessing the Christian high spots of the Galilee was to pedal. So many miracles and so many churches to commemorate them. So many sermons and, unfortunately, so many mounts. I didn't notice an increase in my spirituality, least of all on the uphill bits. Religion entails restrictions. What you can eat and what you can't, what you wear and what you don't but should. Man is born naked as God presumably intended, but everywhere we see him and her, invited not to shock the deity by too blatant a parade of his own creation.
Why is God so hung up about sex? Is he hung up about sex, or are we?
Sex is a powerful human experience. Religion is an attempt in many ways to come to an ordered life. All right?
Yes.
Bring a life that's meaningless and disordered and try to bring it into focus and meaning. Let's face it, one of the most unruly parts of the human psyche and the human body is the sexual drive.
You think that Paul's talk about the tongue being an unruly member was a displacement upwards in Freudian terms?
Well, yeah. I'm not even going to answer that one. You have to bring a Freudian in here to answer that. But I do think that the unruliness of the sexual passion is something that every religious person who takes self-control seriously has to deal with. I think that's why it's become a focus.
Think about all the things happened here. Most of his miracles performed here, more than any place else. 85% of the miracles.
To me, Capernaum's Greco-Roman architecture is a reminder of the pagan gods. But none of today's visitors cover their knees for Venus or bend them to Zeus. So was the existence of these defunct gods ever disproved? What hard evidence can we ever have of any god's existence?
I do think that it's impossible to prove logically anything about God or anything that pertains to faith, but I don't think that Christianity, at least, or any other religion for that matter, claims that all of its faith, its teachings, its practice, all of those things are based on logic. I mean, ultimately, when you look at what Christianity accepts, what its people believe, what they practice, it's based on an experience. And for Christianity, that experience would be At the beginning of the Christian movement, people experienced this risen Christ.
I think one of the things which bothers those of us who are not religious is the pretension, if I can put it that way, to unique rightness. Do you think it's any part of the Christian faith to claim that it is uniquely right?
I think it's one thing to claim it's uniquely right, and another thing to say, accept this or else. Now, when you have a pluralistic world, which is what we have, you know, almost every space is a world space now. You have all these people from all these different cultures, religions, languages pushed together in one place. I love pluralistic cultures. It keeps you honest in your own tradition and forces you to come to some understanding of the others.
This century has been a century in which hostility to God has been exceptionally vigorous. Freud, as we know, wrote a book which he called The Future of an Illusion.
Yes.
And this illusion was man's constant faith in God.
Yes.
So how do you react to this notion of God having been, A, disparaged, and perhaps almost to the point of being about to disappear, and now at the end of the century, apparently having recovered a great deal of his vigor?
No one can tell me that Freud and all of these people, and Marx, who have leveled criticisms against religion, did not do religion a service. We needed to hear those criticisms. But the Russians have a statement I like very much. They say, religion is like a nail. The harder you hit it, the deeper it goes.
Akko, or Acre, Richard the Lionheart's HQ in what had been Arab-dominated country for centuries. Now Muslim boys swim in a harbour which once sheltered those who, in God's name, brought the sword, not peace, to the Holy Land. The Crusaders were assured that God would forgive them if they broke their word to the heathen Saracens. So the Christians reneged on promises and failed to observe truces. If holy advantage could be taken of Muslim good faith and credulity, then God help them. The West now often accuses Muslims of double-dealing, when Christianity, to the greater glory of its God, certainly dealt doubly with them. Some Arabs appear happy to wait patiently until the Jewish state withers away, just as the Crusader kingdoms did, for want of genuine roots. Time will tell, the Arabs say. Who knows whether it will or whether it won't, and what tale it will tell, and which gods it may finally honor. Not only Jews, Muslims or Christians dispute or live in the narrow land of Israel. This is the world headquarters of the Baha'i, a multiracial sect founded in the 19th century by their prophet, a Persian noble called Baha'u'llah, himself a former Shiite mystic. His mission was to reconcile all the great monotheisms.
I'm not a Christian, but certainly Baha'is believe in Christ. I mean, we believe in the founders of all the major world religions.
What form does that belief take? I mean, do you believe that he's the Son of God?
I would believe that he is a messenger from God and that he brought a message for mankind, which was right for the age in which he came.
Is Allah also the same God? Does he have a place in your religion?
Well, we would believe that there is one God, and there are different ways of expressing God. There are different names you can give to God. But that God, in his essence, is unknowable.
One of the things really interesting about the Baha'i religion is that it is new. What are the advantages and disadvantages of novelty in a religion, do you think?
Well, I think one of the distinct advantages is that we have the written words of the prophet of our faith, which were written as and when he spoke them. And it's not distorted by man. It's the essence.
And what are the disadvantages of being a new religion? Are there any? A lack of antique sites?
Well, we have, this and again is really an advantage because it's only 100 years, just over 100 years ago that our founder passed away. So we know exactly where he had been. We know the houses that he lived in, and we visit those places and we know for sure that they're authentic.
Are there rules about dress? Do people have to wear certain clothes?
No.
Do they have to eat certain foods?
No.
Do they have to not eat certain foods?
No.
Do women have to be segregated from men in ceremonies?
No.
Or?
No.
So
What do Baha'is disapprove of?
Well, there are a few don'ts.
Yes.
Drugs is one.
Yes.
Baha'is don't take drugs. They don't take alcohol. There aren't so many.
Do the Baha'is condemn anybody in terms of heresies or people that they regard as devils or people who...
No.
Do you think being so accepting and so generous is actually, in many ways, not what people want from religion? I mean, does it ever occur to you that, in a sense, absence of prejudice and malice may limit your numbers rather than increase them?
I don't think so. This is a new age. This is a time when people are looking for truth. And I think the faith has the answers for them if they investigate it.
There are old answers too, if you know where to look. Very old ones.
Rabbi Weinberg, what are all these young men doing here?
Well, very simple. You know, if you stumble on a gold mine, you stay there and you dig. Everybody's looking for the meaning of life, what the pleasure of life really is. You know, everybody knows that life is gorgeous, and it's such a hassle. It doesn't make sense.
So where are they digging? What
in our heritage.
These born-again Jews are practicing pilpul, the cut and thrust of argument over biblical texts. The trick is not just reading the lines, but reading between them.
No, but this is a moral notion, isn't it? If I break your toy, I don't replace it with a broken toy, I replace it with a toy that is not broken.
But not a better toy. But not for example, it's not a purpose.
No, that would not be the law, that would simply be an act of generosity.
Yeah, if you want to. Right, if you want
yes,
to, whatever you want.
But there's another sensible point here, actually, isn't there, as well, if I understand this correctly, which is, once you have stood on my crate of peaches, how am I ever going to prove to you that they were okay or not okay before? So it would be a prudent lawgiver who said, we cannot actually argue about whether they were bruised before. So let's assume they were. Well, I don't know whether I've spent the afternoon with God. I don't really think I have, but I've spent it with his Jewish followers, very keen ones, who spend their whole lives arguing. And I have to say that I've had a really extraordinary and enjoyable afternoon. It's strange. And I think its strange comes mainly from the fact that these yeshiva students really talk philosophy. They don't talk theology, because everything they're talking about is really quite small and instances which are very like legal instances. And thinking that I was going to be faced with a lot of extremely credulous and tiresome people who only thought one thought, which was that Orthodox Judaism was correct, I wasn't faced with that at all, because in a strange way, they weren't very involved with God, at least not this afternoon.
They were all male, though, and I'm sure they were united in thinking that God was too.
When I was born, the Israeli Postal Service had a telegram, a decorated telegram. There was one for boys, Mazal Tov Leuledet Haben, Mazel Tov for the birth of your son, and there was one for girls, Bat Tchila Siman Yafeh Lebanim, girl first, good sign for boys later. Meaning, plumbing is working, everything's fine, you know what to do, now bring the real thing.
Yes. When you think of the God of the Jews, do you think of a male God?
Absolutely, yes.
And what's his view of women?
Well, basically we are the way to make genetic material, Jewish genetic material, move from one generation to another. I'm seen in my religion as a uterus that talks and walks, but the most important part about me is the uterus.
Why don't you just say no to this God and walk away from him?
My problem is not so much with God. My war is, and the anger is, with the religious establishment. The people who are self-appointed to interpret to us what God wants, and they are chauvinist bullies in Israel.
And is there any conceivable sense in which you can challenge the grammar of God, in the sense that his maleness can be diluted with femaleness? Is it conceivable that there could be a female God?
Yes, in Judaism, yes. And it's right there, built into our religion.
So you think that the maleness of God is something which has been wished upon him rather than a necessary attribute?
Absolutely.
And is that why Moses was permitted to see the backside of God, but not the front, do you think?
This is one of the things we use. We say, from the back, we all look alike.
This is where you'd expect to find nice Jewish girls, doing their housewifely duty in the old submissive way.
This is Friday in the Jerusalem Central Market. Market forces at work, one of the great modern gods to which we all have to bow. But in fact, God has an influence even on market forces, because in about an hour and a half, the sun will set, and none of the food on display here can be sold again until Sunday. And the result is that the prices will fall. So you could say that God was taking care of those with good nerves who would wait till the last moment.
Risking giving offence to the Orthodox, I turned on the square-eyed god of the electronic faith, the god for whom one neither kneels nor stands.
Protect this rare red heifer from those who would harm her. I'm saying, kill the cow. David Landau is an Israeli newspaper editor. He warns that in the hands of fanatic Jews, this cow could trigger a religious war between Jews and Muslims. The state of Israel, which after all is still a secular state, has got to put a stop to this. In the Bible, in Numbers, there are instructions to slaughter and burn a red heifer, cover oneself with the ashes, an ancient purification ritual that enabled biblical Jewish priests to go atop the Holy Temple Mount.
It sounded to me like the point at which respect for religious tradition meets mumbo-jumbo. This I really had to see.
So this is Slil, the red cow who, little does she know it, is supposedly destined to reenact a ritual that took place in the Bible, a ritual which one can hardly believe any modern god would really ask anyone to repeat, to slaughter the animal and to burn it and to smear the result on the faces of the warriors who are going to recapture the Temple Mount. Wittgenstein once said that if lions could speak, we wouldn't understand what they were saying. If this red heifer could speak, we wouldn't understand it any better, I suppose, but I think we might interpret what she said as, why me? Why indeed?
The idea of the red heifer and of preparing this perfect red cow for this concoction that's to be made when the temple is established seems a rather starry-eyed, naive, a little unrealistic, but I don't think it does anyone any harm, and I don't think the individuals need to be considered candidates for an asylum as a result of that. But if we put your red heifer aside for a moment, and let's take an aspect which is a normative aspect of ritual, and if you say, isn't there a danger that you become so obsessive with these areas that it distorts your overall perspective in relation to the rest of society? My answer again and again is yes. And I think that's a perfectly natural human response to that.
You're an Orthodox rabbi.
Yeah.
You don't surely seriously think that it's up to each individual Jew whether or not to produce a very clear instance, he has a bacon sandwich.
Of course it's up to him to do it. That's exactly what the Bible says. The Bible says in Deuteronomy, I have given you, says God, essentially the capacity of free choice. I haven't given you that in order not to be able to exercise it. I have given you good, I have given you evil, I have given you life, I have given you death. Make your choice. There are consequences to your actions, but you have to make the choice. If you're doing it because you have no choice, then what is the value of your action?
If you discover that members of your congregation drove to synagogue on a Saturday, you wouldn't just say, oh, well, if you feel like driving, drive, would you?
Of course not, because there I would say, if you are now seeking to be part of a particular community and of a particular tradition and of its values and of its ideals, then you should strive to improve your lifestyle in accordance with those aspirations of that particular tradition and heritage. You should. Driving on Sabbath is not the ideal. The ideal is to have a different kind of day, and I would try to explain what that day is all about so that the individual will be able to see its beauty, see the ideal, and voluntarily choose to live that way of life.
I wonder how much choosing there really can be in any Orthodox community, with all its pressures to conform. At their bar mitzvah, these Jewish boys become Jewish men. they make a choice which precludes further choosing, except at the cost of social ostracism. As soon as the pious of any faith are inside their piety, it is God who chooses them, for once and for all.
What's really extraordinary about this is that when you think about people who believe in God, you wonder how, after the Holocaust, they possibly can. And then again, standing here by the Wailing Wall and looking at these Jews doing something which at least imitates something that Jews have been doing for thousands of years, and the whole of Hitler's Reich has been blown away, you realize how they can believe that in spite of the death of 6 million Jews, God somehow, for whatever reason, sees them through and watches as the Assyrians and the Nazis disappear into oblivion.
God's last known address may well be Jerusalem, but my last destination had to be his first known address, amongst the rocks and sand of the Egyptian desert.
So how many gods have you found in Israel? Well, only the one, really. I was surprised at the convergence of the monotheisms. I expected them to be antagonistic, but they refused to be. And in fact, you realize that God was the first kind of spiritual single currency. And what have the gods of the Middle East got to do with you, then? Not as much as one might think, or maybe some people would hope. The answer is they seem a lot more foreign here than they do in England. One hears Arabic, one hears Hebrew, and one knows that one doesn't speak either. And the result is that God's reach seems not to be very great, although his intensity certainly bears down heavily, particularly on Jerusalem. And where are you off to now? Well, we're off to Mount Sinai, where Moses took delivery of the Ten Commandments, and where he also, owing to a gracious gesture, actually saw God. He only saw the backside of God, if I can put it that way, so the sex was indeterminate. I don't imagine that he'll be showing very much of himself to me, but one never knows. The top of Mount Sinai, where Moses met his God, and God, for their future joy and pain, chose the Jews. 1,000 miles from here, there was another mountain god. His name was Zeus, and he was born in Crete. Zeus agreed to have his picture everywhere. His sculptures were throughout the ancient world. This god told Moses that no image of him should appear. Zeus seemed to have all the publicity, but the God who started on this mountain knew better. I am that I am.